is a Brazilian, and but studied in the University of Berlin, the Humboldt Universität, with Stephen Mann, after having studied philosophy at the University of Brasília. And he's currently a fellow of the Martin Buber Society. Have you just finished your stint? You just finished your stint, and is in the process of returning back to Brazil. So it's a great opportunity for us to have you with us. So thank you very much for speaking to us today on Providence and the care of temporal beings in Proclus. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you for the invitation. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here. So you should have a handout, and the handout / text dossier. So the beginning, there's the structure of the talk I'll be going through, and then at the end there are many texts I'll be referring to. I won't be reading through all these texts, but they'll be also important perhaps for our discussion. Some of them. So, and I will be referring to them. So I'll talk for 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion. Okay, so first of all, the first point that I want to make is that Providence is not primarily providential organization. That's the first thing to start to understand about the connection between time and providence and in Proclus. And we can see this in proposition 120 of the Elements of Theology that you'll find in your handout. So that's in the first text at the bottom of page 105, and then continues on to page 107. And so here, perhaps just some background. Sorry, I don't want to jump into things too much, right? So, for those new to him, so Proclus is a philosopher from the 5th century CE. The Elements of Theology is his probably best known work, although he's not very well known, so it's fine not to know it. And it's the earliest example we have of a metaphysics more geometrical. It is an unfinished work. It has not managed to fully elementarize metaphysics from his point of view. So, most notably, there are no axioms or definitions in this work. And what I want to do today is that I want to take a look exactly at how providence and time are connected for Proclus, how providence somehow grounds time. And I'll be going, and so last year I published a volume by Brill, Time's Causal Power, on Proclus's philosophy of time, and I'll be going a bit further beyond what I do in the book. But let's start here at in proposition 120. We read, and I'll be reading Dodd's translation. Every God embraced in his substance the function of exercising providence towards the universe, and the primary providence resides in the gods. So providence here is patronoia. And normally when you think of providence, you think of the foreknowledge of the gods, or the way they order the universe towards their ends, or even the interventions they have in the world to make sure that those ends take place. But if you read Proclus' proposition, you'll find out that that's not exactly what he has in mind. So he writes this, for if the obvious distinctive of the providential character is the bestowal of good things upon the beings which are its objects, and if every god is in excellence, then either the gods will communicate themselves to no recipient, and there will thus be nothing good in the secondary existences, and going on, or if they communicate anything, what they communicate is good, and in this way they will exercise providence towards all things. So first of all, there's this claim, every god is an excellence. Excellence is agathos, and and it works in a similar way to henas in Proclus. Right? So henas is how Proclus is a noun that he uses in order to be able to have a plural for hen, for top hen, for the one. And the gods, each god for Proclus is something like the one. It's an entirely simple unit, and each of them is a first principle. How the connection between Tohen, the principle of unity, and the many gods, the many henads, is unclear. Proclus has no full account of how the many henads proceed from the one. And scholars go from one extreme that sees them as just aspects, expressions of the one, to another end which sees each of them as an absolute first principle standing on its own. And I think the text don't let us really decide this debate. But Proclus is a Platonist. He follows Plato in seeing the one or unity as identical with the good. And so each of these simple ones, each of these unities, is also itself a good or a value or an excellence in Don's translation. And being each of them an excellence or a goodness, they communicate themselves. What they communicate to other beings is itself goodness. Like following standard Neoplatonic analogies of the sun that makes things light, or the fire that warms other things. They are good, and by their being, they make other things good. Right? So, and this bestowal of goodness on other things is the primary meaning of pronoia for Proclus. Right? So later on in the text, you read, Providence then resides primitively in the gods, for indeed, where should activity prior to intelligence, nous, be found, if not in the principles above being? And Providence, as its name, pronoia, shows, is an activity prior to intelligence, pro nous. Right. So Proclus follows Plotinus in saying that Tohen is prior to nous, right? And therefore he interprets pronoia not as some kind of nous thinking, reasoning beforehand, that happens beforehand, but rather as an activity that happens prior to nous, right? It's this initial establishing of what is good that nous presupposes, right? So if you think about how nous, right, originally is some kind of virtue, and you find in Plato hendiads like nous kai sophia, and so it's the virtue of the good man that allows him to know what is good and to be successful in doing good things. And then that gets hypostaticized as a cosmic reason in Anaxagoras and then Plato, and that then directs the whole world towards the good. So here in Proclus also the establishment of goods, of what is good, happens before nous, and nous takes its direction from it. And you'll see in Proposition 122, I won't go into detail in this, but he uses this idea of providence as simply the values causing things to be valuable as a way to solve the question of how can the gods be both transcendent and exercise providence. Because since it's just the fact that they are good, and by being good, they make other things good, then they don't have to make, there's no extra activity, there's not even a relation that they take towards the things, towards the objects of providence, right? And so that's what 122 does. I brought here also an excerpt from a text by a polytheist Brazilian philosopher, Vicente Pedro da Silva, which I think he expresses this very well, and he was influenced, and he might have read Proclus, but it's unclear. He does use Neoplatonic terminology at times, but he was very influenced by Cambridge and German philologians, and he developed this polytheistic philosophy based on Schelling and Heidegger. And so he really captures this idea of the gods as the sources of value that are prior to nous and to an intellectual apprehension of the world. So I'll just read from him a bit. So he starts by, in this passage, this is from a programmatic essay of his mythology and the tropic experience of being. So saying being is not solely the prodigal bestower of essences, but rather initially the arouser of passions, the tropic fount of all behaviors. The tracing of beings would manifest itself, according to Heidegger, with the eruption of an emotional field and not as a simple sketching out of visualizable essences or as a world of representations. And then lower in the second paragraph, he disagrees with Heidegger by saying that it's actually this experience of being is not found in poetry, but rather in myth, right? So the experience of being would take place in entering and becoming intimate with the tropic force of fascination. And if for Heidegger the setting to work of the truth of being takes place in poetry, for us this should be understood above all as transhuman poetry. It's poetry in itself as the transcendent life of the divine powers. The gods embodied in an unsurpassable way the immediate flashing out of the source of fascination. The gods are this flashing out of that source. The gods are this very flashing out as light is productive both in itself and by itself. The creation of a god is the area revealed by the divine eros, which is what is prospected and delineated by the force of this theophany. And he goes on to explain this in more detail. This kind of text that helps who it helps and doesn't help who it doesn't help. But for a certain temperament, this Heideggerian rhetoric can be useful in just understanding this idea of a preliminary establishment of what is valuable that then reason takes its cues from. So that's the first thing. So when we ask ourselves how is providence established in or how is time grounded by providence for Proclus, we're actually going to be asking how does this establishment of goods constitute time? How is that important for time? It should be noted, however, that there is also a use of pronoia. There's a secondary use of pronoia in Proclus. So you can see that in Proposition 134. Which is after the text of the saint in your handout. And so he says, every divine intelligence exercises intellection qua intelligence, but providence qua God. And so sometimes he will use providence in this other sense as a kind of eternal knowledge of temporal things, and that organizes them. And I've also provided an excerpt from the commentary on the Parmenides, where he's doing just this, and he's comparing here providence to a man who, just by imagining a ship, makes it come to be, and he only has to look at his own imagination to know what the world is like. And he says that's what providence is like, and then he goes on talking about the divine intellect. And in this case, he's actually talking about nous, and he's talking more about providence in the sense that we more typically use it. But this is a secondary meaning of providence. But I just wanted to flag that as when we come to time, Proclus holds that time itself is a nous and a god. But before I do that, I don't want to go too quickly here. Do we already have some questions of understanding? I don't want to run over anyone.
Just to evaluate the rather odd, I mean, interesting the silver.
Yes.
So is this the identification of the gods with the ideas in Schelling that he's drawing on? And so that's the link with the handout, is it?
I'm not so good about Schelling, so I'm not.
Yeah, well, you find that in Moritz and Schelling in particular. So that culminating of Schelling's philosophy of art has this philosophy of understanding art in terms of mythology, and
right.
the Goethe are the expressions of ideas.
Yeah, so I mean, his drawing on this. Well, what he does explicitly draw on Schelling is this idea of a theophanic series, a theogonic series.
Yes,
there are different divine powers in different epochs, and so he's plugging that into Heidegger, saying this thing that Heidegger is saying is a revelation of being is actually this divine series manifesting itself.
Yes.
but he finds the talk about gods more interesting than, say, just Heidegger's appeal to lyric poetry, in part because he thinks that then you can talk about these. This revelation is primarily concerns the will, right, and not intellect. It's being as an arouser of passions, and he thinks that this is that's what the appeals to gods give him, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's a question about muse.
So yeah.
Isn't it traditionally understood as non-discursive, sort of
Right.
non-discursive?
Yes.
Vision? And is the argument or Proclus's argument now that there's something pre-established, in a way, disordering of what is good?
Yeah. So the idea is that, so this is interesting. So there are many henads, there are many gods, many goodnesses for Proclus. There are also many noes. There are also many nous, right? This is a novelty that comes from Plotinus. Right? Plotinus 4 times uses nooi as the plural of nous and 4 times noes, indicating that there's probably not an established plural. And so, yeah, it is non-discursive, and it is supposed to be some kind of simple intuition of intelligible things. Rather, for me, what I think is the best way to explain nous for Proclus is that it's an intelligible object that makes itself known, right? So when nous noe, it's not grasping something outside itself, it's not grasping some kind of other object, it's just making itself known, the way the sun makes itself visible to nous. And but the, how to say this, what does it make known? Proclus makes known all of being. Each nous makes all of being known, but according to different categories. And so some are simpler, so some will just express all of being according to the category of being, and some have many small categories. But all of this is relative to some goodness, some expression form of the good itself. And yeah, so Plotinus also has expressions that Proclus would find too mythical or something, but too story-like, of how nous comes to be by turning and looking at the one, the good, and then this vision is what constitutes as nous. Proclus never talks that way, but a reference to the good is implicit in this kind of knowledge, even if it isn't step by step, right, in discursive.
Yeah, Providence is beyond.
Providence is beyond that. Yeah, Providence is some kind of establishment of what's good prior to nous, prior to the forms, right? But then, so once its good is established, then there's a secondary providence, which is then organizing the world according to these goods, right? So there's first an establishment of ends, and then this secondary activity. Good.
That's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's
if I could just, sorry,
Sure.
So the first model of pronoia is is linked to the goodness that is prior to the activity of the intellect. You then have the second model, and then you pointed to this translation. Is this from the Taylor translation?
what this
From the commentary on that?
No, this is Dylan Mora.
Oh, Dylan Mora. Okay, right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, it doesn't. Yes, it's less exuberant.
You won't find any energies here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sorry, and the point there was the distinction between the two models, the two paradigms of pronoia.
Pronoia, and Proclus will call them both pronoia.
Yeah.
But when he's speaking his official, using his official terminology, it's more the prior one. But when he's being more loose, then he'll also talk about intellect exercising pronoia.
Okay, right. Yeah.
And the example from the Parmenides commentary is just to show the example of that.
Great, thank you.
So now the texts that we'll be looking at are on the talk structure. So now we come to time, and let me just first of all explain. So Proclus saying that time is a nous and a God. So I'll go over this. So you have here, I just provided two passages, one on each of these ones. So the first is on how the theologians call time as a God, and in the second about how it must be a nous, right? So here I have a translation of nous as kind of intelligence, which I use in order to avoid the idea that these are different subjects, right? Each of them is, as it were, a kind of intelligence, a kind of wisdom, right? They're not subjects of knowing, but
which page?
oh, this should be on the first page of the handout. Yeah. And but let me just explain a bit. Well, I'll get to the text in a moment, but explain a bit what's meant by being a nous and a God. So Proclus accepts Plotinus's view that the passage of time is actually the inner life, the cognitive life of the world soul, right? So it's the only process, or Plato says that time is a kinesis, so there must be a process that is time. And the thoughts of the world soul are the only uniform, omnipresent process that could fit the bill. However, he says this isn't time itself. Time itself is going to be the nous that illuminates the world soul, right? It's its own particular kind of intelligence and its unique wisdom. And so this is an eternal substance that's that the world soul is dependent on. And there's and it's not just a nous, however, right? It's also a God. So what does that mean? That means that this nous itself is dependent on a finite, right? It is dependent on a goodness, a specific kind of goodness. And this, for Proclus, this nous plays the role of Aristotle's first unmoved mover. It is the nous that generates cosmic motion. And he'll use this reasoning for each of the other unmoved movers of the cosmos. So, for instance, the unmoved mover of the sun is the year itself. The unmoved mover of the moon is the month itself, right? And the unmoved mover of the whole world is time itself, right? So, and each of these is an eternal nous that causes the thoughts of a given world soul, that moves a body, that defines a certain unit of time. In the case of the whole world, it's the great year, right? So yeah, so this is the so if you read, yeah, so it's in the first text. Since this is so, they, the theologians, do not merely celebrate time as a god, but also day itself and night, as well as the month and the year, and plausibly so too, but there must be an entirely unchanging cause for things that are carried around eternally and different in form one from another, right? So precisely this idea, so it's the idea that you need this unchanging cause for specifically different, distinct things. It's a bit formulated a bit more broadly than Aristotle, but so that's the root of this in arguments from Physics 8 and Metaphysics 12. And then in the following, isn't the following the best to say that since it is itself a substance and is perfective of souls, right? It's a nous that illuminates, huh? And present to all changing things, time is a kind of intelligence that not only remains identical but also changes. It remains identical according to its inner activity, by which it is also really eternal, while it changes according to its outwardly proceeding activity, by which it determines every change from one state to another. So this is this outwardly proceeding activity is actually the thoughts of the world soul, right? Which are the passage of time. So this is the Aristotelian idea that if you, when an agent acts on a patient, and so the patient changes, the agent not necessarily, but there's one energeia, there's one activity, right? And And so that is this outwardly proceeding activity of the nous of time itself, and that's the passage of time. It's this purely uniform cognitive life of the world soul. So that's the idea that time of his idea of what time itself is, and I've written here that it's the monad of cosmic nous. What does that mean? Since it's the nous of the world itself, every other nous, in the sense of a separately existing nous, is going to be like time, right? And an example of this are the units of time, but other noes are also very similar. So that's the question, and what I want to ask you then is, I'm interested in my talk today more about the passage of time, how the pronoia of this God somehow constitutes the passage of time. How will its establishment of certain goods be somehow constitute time? So, yes, please.
Okay, so is the passage of time, so this outward proceeding activity,
Yes.
so is time especially related to the world soul?
Yes.
So time is the outward proceeding activity of the world soul?
No. It's outward proceeding activity of the nous, right? Of time itself.
Mm-hmm.
So this what is outward for time itself will be internal for the world soul. So that's the internal life of the world soul, its thoughts, and then the outward proceeding activity from the world soul will then be its giving life to the whole world.
So just to get this straight.
Yeah.
So I mean, you could say that one of the key aspects of Plotinus's account of time, of eternity and time in 3-7 is the archetype image relation, so that time is, going back to Plato's Timaeus in his critique of Aristotle's world immanent notion of time, so that he's conceiving of time as an image of its archetype, and that's why he links time to the life of the soul. Now there, the archetype image relation for understanding time and eternity is primarily soul in relation to unchanging intellect.
So here it's become more complicated.
Yes.
and so what he is still trying to stay close to Timaeus.
Yes.
But what he's seen is time is a moving image of eternity according to number. What is this number? This number he takes to be this intellect that he calls time itself. And also when Plato says that it's an eternal image, he says, so there's also an eternal time. It's not just a changing one. And he will say that there's an image paradigm relationship between this number and number itself, right? Which is a far more basic cause for him. There is also still a relationship with eternity, but it's far less direct, right? Direct is itself, eternity is itself a cause for this number itself. But yeah, it's far less in the foreground. He's trying really, there are many reasons for this. One of them is trying to answer to Aristotle, right? Trying to answer Aristotle, explain what kind of number is time, right?
Right.
And then he'll say, it's not a counted number, it's not a countable number, it's a counting number. It's this nous that's counting, and the De Mundo has a good image for this, right? The De Mundo has this image of as God as some kind of general that uses a trumpet, and then there's one sound and the whole army knows what to do. And so it's like the time is like this general, always giving the beat for the whole world and everything and what it's doing. So it's counting out the moments of the world. That's the kind of number it is. Yes.
So yes, no, thank you for that. So just to try and get clear about this, so the Proclus is still operating with the image and archetype model.
Yeah.
It's just he's construing it in a rather different way.
He's construing it in a rather different way. And of course, it's still important that the whole world is an image of the living being itself. But yeah, he's construing both the world has more parts to it as a finer analysis, and the intelligible world with finer analysis to it that results in these.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Actually, that is actually important for what I'm going to say. So, because on a very basic level, you can say that the good that time provides the world is similarity to the living being itself, and so that's one basic good that it provides. Right, but also, okay, but I also want to just mention here that time is not alone in exercising providence in the world. Also, the superior genre. So these are the superior genre. These are beings that are between human souls and the gods in Proclus. So typically they're just called. Sometimes they're just called the superior genre, right? The Cretola, right? But sometimes they're also called daimones. Daimones is a blanket term for them, but sometimes they're divided into three, into angulo, daimones, and heroi. Right? So you have angels, messengers, daimons, spirits, and heroes as the three kinds. This is something that already comes from Iamblichus, right? It's been a bit simplified. Iamblichus will then also talk about archangels and other things. Archangels also make an appearance in Proclus, but they're not part of his standard division of the superior genre. And they are, what's interesting about them is that usually already in Iamblichus, they seem to be a kind of soul. They're the superior souls to us. That's not exactly how it is in Proclus. And I've given you propositions 183, 184 of the elements. Right, so that will be my page is hard it's up now. So I'm not sure where it is in our handout.
It's page 161.
On the count, yeah. As you can see, 161 on the corner. So it's also in Dodd's translation. So, and here you see in 183, he talks about intelligence which is participated but purely intellectual, right? That isn't divine, right? It just doesn't have is not dependent on the henad. And it is participated by souls which are neither divine nor yet subject to the alteration of intelligence with unintelligence. That's our souls. Sometimes we have nous, sometimes we don't. But above us, but not yet divine, there are these souls that always have nous. They always are in a state of intellection. And then he talks about the same thing from the perspective of souls, or in the 184, right? Every soul is either divine or subject to change, or else intermediate between these two, enjoying perpetual intellection, although inferior to the divine souls. So these superior genera are actually noes that have psyche dependent upon them, the way our psyche have bodies dependent on them, right? So they are noes, so they're kinds of wisdom that exists separately, each of them, as it were, separately existing metaphysics. And it has a psyche, which also has a body, that it uses as an instrument, right? So these are as it were, if you could imagine a separately existing craft or science, right? And so, and that indeed is one of the functions that these daimons have. For instance, there'll be a daimon specific for each animal species, and that Proclus doesn't go into this, but I understand that then to be something like separately existing biology of that species, right? Remember that the Aristotle says that physics is a productive science, right? And so it would be something similar to that. So that's what the superior genre are, and they're also involved in providence. You might not expect that because they don't have henads, right? They're not dependent immediately on a god. They're not divine themselves, but they do assist the gods, and that's what I've given you in the following text on the handout. That's page 117, 118 in the Shales. This is Shales' translation of 10 Problems Concerning Providence. And so here, this is the last problem, and he says, the God, I'm reading from paragraph 65 at the bottom of 117. The gods exercise providence over the whole universe through the whole of themselves, but they are what they are, as we said, by being all henads, right? But angels and demons and heroes exercise providence insofar as they too have some seed of the one, not insofar they are alive or intelligizing. For the latter two show them either as merely bestowing motion on non-self movers, giving life to a body, or as merely cognizing beings. For it is proper to soul and to move, and proper to intellect to think. Whereas to exercise providence belongs to the one that is in them, right? But that according to which they imitate the gods is also that according to which they exercise providence together with them over all things. And there's a description of that. So these are also, so they will assist the gods, imitate the gods also in exercising providence through this one in them. This one in them is the one of the soul. He compares it to the one of the soul right after it, and this is then a long later career after Proclus, the divine spark and man and things. But that's just to establish. So these are also involved in providence, and we're going to take a look at a text from the Parmenides commentary that will talk about both time and the superior genre. This is actually, so I'm throwing this light on the superior genre and drawing attention to that because normally it's very difficult to understand why are there just these three kinds and why, what are their different functions. There'll be separate discussions of each in Proclus, but it's hard to find the systematic need for these mediators and for three kinds of mediators. But in this text on time, we find at least one argument for why you think we need three. Right. We started 5 minutes after, is that right?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so I'll just talk a bit more. I won't go into all the details, but let's just take a look at this text. So you have here I gave you, so this is Dylan Morrow's translation of Proclus's commentary on 141DE in the Parmenides. So this is when he's discussing the different forms of the verb enai, geniustai. Okay? And so for Proclus, this is a description of a certain order of a certain divine order, and actually it's a description of divine souls and their connection to time. Because he thinks that the many negations, this is from the first hypothesis of the Parmenides, which denies successively attributes of the one. For Proclus, he follows Syrianus in saying these denials are actually denying that the one belongs to a certain category of gods. Right? Denying that the one, and saying that it transcends a specific category. And the specific category is then indicated by the predicates that are denied of the one.
So this is cataphatic theology, basically.
Yes. With the, right, and he specifically thinking that you're denying it's belonging to certain divine orders, because there's the idea that it would be silly of Plato to simply think that it's denying that the one is in time. That would be too simple, because it's eternal things are not in time. The one is beyond eternal things. So, and also this is perhaps not so clear when you're talking about time, but there are also other predicates about denied are being round and being straight, and so in general. And so here he thinks it's talking about the divine orders that constitute time. And it's interesting, I won't be able to go into this, but it's not only tense, but also aspect, right? So he thinks that these are two different sides to time. So one is past, present, and future, and the other is perfective and perfective aorist, right? So, but we won't be able to go into these. Things we'll just talk about past, present, and future today. And he talks about this as being about time, but it's not so. I mean, as about the superior genre, but it's not so clear. So I gave you the Greek in the handout, just, but I'll be reading from the translation. So this is the bottom of page 575. And if you wish to look at things in another way, since the ordering of those souls superior to us, let me just a moment, try to find it.
So 575.
Here we are.
575 at the bottom. If you wish to look at things in another way, since the ordering of those souls superior to us is divided into those which are primal and intermediate and ultimate, the most universal of them are connected properly with the past, as comprehending both the present and the future. So even as the first of these comprehends the two latter, even so do those souls comprehend the two remaining categories. The intermediate souls are related to the present, for this was once future, but is not yet past. So even as the present comprehends the future, so also the median souls are comprehensive of those following on them, but are comprehended by those prior to them. The third group is connected with the future, for this has not traversed the present, nor has it yet become past, but is still future only. Even as also this third category of souls exists only for themselves, and because of the descent into the extreme of partialness, are not yet comprehensive of any others. For these comprise the lowest limit by reason of the division into three parts of classes of being following upon the gods. Since for each in turn of these three universal categories is a triune multiplicity dependent upon it, right? So, and then he goes, this then initiates the discussion of aspect that we won't be able to go into. But so these terms, the soul superior to us and those that follow upon the gods, these are the classes of being following upon the gods, right? So that's just genre again in the Greek, and that's just standard terminology for these three classes of angels, spirits, and heroes in him. So they seem to be each connected, especially with past, present, and future. At the moment, just seems like some kind of analogy. So past is everything that's future is not yet present, but everything that's present has been future, and everything that is past has been present and future. So the past encompasses all three, and the top of the order encompasses all three. So that's just a thing. So I just want to at least get to exactly how this is connected to pronoia. And for that, let me just read a bit before. So now this is what I have here. So, but perhaps it is better in 1235. So this is at the bottom of page 574, right? So it should be in the page, the previous page of the handout. And then he'll say, but perhaps it is better to say that all these entities, so all the entities that act through time, right, the different orders that act through time, act throughout the whole of time. But the one is perfective of all motion, right? The other, which is such as to gather together and preserve all things which are beneath its rule. And the third, revelatory of the divine, So this gather together is actually synchrate. So to connect, and telesiurgon is perfective, and ekpantolikos is revelatory. We have the
Apologies, this is on page
574.
574. Yeah.
Yeah. And at the bottom, but perhaps it is better.
Yeah.
So on the handout, you'll find the Greek for this in the third page of the handout. Second. And so it seems, so it seems that they're responsible for these three properties of perfection, connection, and revelation. And if you look at elements of theology, I provided proposition 133 for you. Let me just find it. It should be right. Exactly. And if you look at the examples he gives here of different kinds of idiomas of agapothetos, he will tell you telesiurgein, esynethein, ephrodein, right? Perfecting or preserving in unity or shielding from harm. And these are two of these terms, other terms he's using here, telesiurgein and synethein. And so it seems that these are different goodnesses, different excellences in Dodd's translation.
Hello, Samuel.
Oh, hello. And and so it seems that this is, if we're going to start understanding how providence and time are connected in Proclus, it's through these three goodnesses. So these are three things that were established as good, or three goodnesses that were shared with beings by the gods, primarily by this god, which is time, which is Chronos, and then they are then specifically then given to beings through these three kinds of superior genre. So the angels are supposed to be perfected or cause perfection to things. The daimonis connection and the hero's revelation, and thereby to constitute past, present, and future. I have some ideas of how this happens, but let me pause here again for questions. And if we get to it, we get to it. If not. So that's just the broad setup about how these action of pronoia as establishing goods, then also leads can play a role in explaining the time. So the questions until here. So please.
Are we now already in the discussion? Are we still in the pronoia that transcends use, or are we?
So I think this is actually a moment where, precisely like in a full account, we'd see both of them somehow playing out in the constitution of time. When I pointed to this proposition 133, I think it was to talk about the pronoia that transcends nous, right? So it seems like establishing these different goods of perfection, connection, and also revelation is somehow something that happens prior to nous. And then you have these noes, the superior genre, that then order beings according to these different goodnesses and thereby constitute the distinction between past, present, and future. So here's like the constitution of time should be a place where we can see both of the kinds of pronoia acting together.
Because once those superior genres are included, it seems like
exactly we're going to have to.
We're no longer talking about this transcendent.
Yeah, exactly. He says that they exercise Proclus, but just through this one in them, but it would seem that precisely they're no longer establishing something as good, they're just organizing something, other things in view of a good.
What's the link between that and the famous Proclus Chaldean doctrine of the anthos to new anthos tes?
Right, so it seems that this one in them is the
flower.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Right. And through that, they, and also human beings at given times, become instruments of the gods in something, and thereby become somehow become the gods. That seems to be like the way that my pen is my instrument. And so when I'm writing,
Yes.
the pen is writing, but actually I'm the agent, I'm the author. And so this is the kind of unity with the God that this anthos to know can provide. We become, as it were, instruments, organs of it. Right. And so when they're constituting past, present, future, the distinction between past, present, and future, these superior genre would be then agents of time itself, which is a god, and perhaps also of the other celestial gods, depending on. So they would do that with regard to past, present, time taken absolutely. They're taken with regard to the great year, so the past great year, the future great year, this great year. But since each of the celestial gods has its own unit of time that it measures, and so there are different ways of saying what's future, what's past. So depending on what we're thinking now to be today, or this month, or this year, and so on, then you have different hosts of superior genre and constituting past, present, future relative to each of these units of time.
Thank you, Chris. That's helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Simon, I'm sure you've understood everything I said.
I think, yeah, that's from your handout on the way up. I'd love to hear you talk more about, or just in general, about Proclus's methodology.
Okay.
Perhaps as it applies to this, but just, yeah.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. So, as I mentioned before, when he's commenting on the Timaeus and trying to interpret what he means by time there, he seems to be mostly trying to defend the Timaeus against Aristotle, right? So the Timaeus is at times Kinesis. Aristotle's a battery of arguments against this. Proclus then tries to answer each of these, sometimes appealing to Aristotle himself. So when he says that time is not a numbered number nor a numberable number, but a numbering number, he's drawing on generation of animals and generation of corruption that talks about time. So talks about the number that numbers out, that counts out the lifespans of individual animals, and he's applying this to the whole world. And here, what he's doing is actually probably something that he does elsewhere. So generally, here he doesn't do this, not explicitly, but usually when you have a passage of Plato in the Timaeus, for instance, there'll be first two commentators. It's hard to know who they are, but I mean, he doesn't name them, but it's usually Porphyry and then Iamblichus. And Porphyry gives the sensible, something close to the text. Iamblichus has this wondrous thing, but it's really hard to know how it relates to the text. And then Syrianus or Proclus then tries to come up with something as wondrous but closer to the text. And here it doesn't refer to Iamblichus, but certainly we know from Iamblichus that he already had this idea of a superior time that was this eternal time, or now the crowns time, the passage of time. And Richard Sorabji managed to make some sense of this, connecting it to solution to the paradoxes about the now. But there's more to it, and we don't. Proclus maybe then be trying to do something similar here, and also this inclusion here of the superior genre, right, is also indication that there might be some Iamblichian background here that he's trying to rationalize or something. I think if there are, that's what I would say about the methodology behind these passages.
And this is where the sort of medieval notion of the Irrtum comes from, this sort of intermediate level between
Yeah, I think.
the sort of mode of existence of the angels, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if that's where it comes from, or rather it's from something Plotinus, that's already Plotinus, where Plotinus says that the soul can't properly be said to be in time because its thoughts constitute time. And so, and Proclus has similar things. And Philoponus, when he's arguing against Proclus, and he wants to say, you know, there is before and after that's not in time, and therefore, because there has to be a before and after for every now, then you can still have a first now. It's just that before is not in time. And the argument he uses, and Simplicus is very unhappy with this. The argument that he uses, I was just at a presentation about this by Jan also, is precisely that, well, the soul properly, or so properly speaking, when it no ways uses snooze, it has a succession of thoughts that's not in time. And I guess then that can
No,
yeah, because yeah, I don't know of successors to this time as intellect theory, this time as nous theory. Yeah, please.
On methodology, I wanted to ask how we actually understand the more geometric, which you mentioned in the beginning. Is
What?
the method of
geometrical. Right. So in the Parmenides commentary, Proclus discusses the relationship between Zeno and Parmenides, and he says that, and he says, God forbid that they should actually defend different things. No, Parmenides and Zeno agreed about everything. However, like a good student, Zeno presented the thoughts of his master in a new form, right? So Parmenides wrote his poem, and Zeno then developed these reductio ad absurdum arguments to defend the same point. And it seems that and the idea of doing this more geometrical metaphysics isn't new with Proclus. He had already done a more geometrical physics, right? The elements of physics, which is just a version of Aristotle's Physics Book 6, well, 6 to 8, but and Book 6 is itself already more geometrical. Thomas, in his commentary on the physics, says this that Aristotle's arguing like the geometers. And so he probably took the idea from there, and then he's saying, but then he's like being a good student and putting the thoughts of his master into a totally new form. At least that's how he would see it, because also it seems that he always agrees with Syrianus whenever he presents him. There are some scholars that try to piece out between what belongs to Syrianus and what belongs to Proclus. I find this very difficult to do.
But Euclid is presumably the
Yeah. Euclid is the pattern. He has a commentary on Euclid as well, and of course there are other element-like works that we've lost. It was a genre, but as I said, it's an incomplete work. So you'll find propositions with very different style. The first propositions are very thin vocabulary, and they really argue step by step. Later, these propositions about the gods, especially, they do these things of, say, piling three synonymous expressions one after another, and they sound more Yamlichean, so to speak. And so it seems like it hasn't been fully elementarized. And for this reason, there aren't axioms or definitions. Like you can sometimes people will say there are no axioms or definitions because this is supposed to be metaphysics. It's the first hypothetical science. And if that were the only omission, and otherwise it was a beautiful elements, I would accept that. But there's just too many imperfections in this text. And I think that the fact is just when you're writing such a text, elements definitions come at the end for the things you didn't manage to give an argument for. And since it's an unfinished text, that's just why we don't have it. That's what I have to say about this presentation.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
I don't know if it makes any sense, but what is the connection between theology and the notion of time in Proclus? There is anything like that? Because here in this passage,
he mentions the theory.
Exactly.
Right. So because of the theurgists, he has this report that Chronos is a god, right? And that's something important. That's an
Yes,
authority, so
okay.
he has to account for that. So and they also apparently have these not only Chronos but men and other units of time are gods. So he has to account for that.
Okay.
But more than that is specifically, and does he have something? I think Professor has something about the importance of doing theurgical rituals at the appropriate moment at the Kairos,
Okay.
and I think that's in the Republic commentary. I'll find some commentary to that effect. But also a note about Chronos as a god. I don't know. So I don't know how to cash out claims of divine identity in Proclus, but it's clear that time is the nous of the world soul. And so, and it's a god, so it's going to be dependent on a hand. It's going to be the primary god, the god of the whole world. The god of the whole world is, in other passages, clearly Dionysus. So I don't know, is Chronos just a name for Dionysus? Are they two different gods that somehow share the same nous? Shouldn't happen. I don't know, but there's some connection with Dionysus here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, he has other things for the theurgists. That time appears as a spiral is something that he gets from them as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a further question. So I'm sort of trying to understand how to locate this first phenomena still.
Sure.
So if we look at Plotinus' hierarchy, and so we have the one, and
Yes.
below that the intellect.
Yeah.
And so I understood intellect as sort of the plane where you locate nous.
Yes.
And so does that mean that Proclus introduces a layer between the one and intellect? Because clearly the one is
That's
absolutely simple. And so I don't know where to fit this first providence that transcends the noetic.
that is the question. So for Proclus already, so Proclus, there are levels prior to nous, prior to intellect. Should we speak of them? Actually, this is where the whiteboard becomes handy. Can I get the?
Please do.
There's a marker there, I saw. Oh, that's not. Make sure that this. Right, the washes well. So, right, so you have intellect and soul, world, and then you have, say, as causal this thought. For Proclus, now there's going to be things between the reality and the one. Especially there's going to be being and what he calls life. And then, all right, and then sometimes he talks about then life goes here, intellect. But being and life are distinct. He's not going to talk about many beings here and about many lives, as he will talk about there. And there's intellect and many intellect, soul, many souls, the world, and many bodies, right? Rather, being is here, being as a whole. And life is some kind of structuring principle, like being just divided but not yet specified. And for each of these levels, he thinks that you can't actually account for them directly from the one. You need one of these henads, right? There needs to be a one here, or rather more because of internal complexity, right? So there's what he calls, so there's an order of the gods, right? An order, a divine order. And then there's the noetic gods, and then there's going to be the intelligible intellectual gods, the noetic, noer. There's going to be a divine order for each of these, right? So these are the unities, the sources of unity for each of these things, right? Because the one itself can't be a cause, it can't be in relation to the things that it causes, otherwise it wouldn't be absolute anymore. Now, so here he's introduced this multitude of henads. What is the relationship to the one? It's not clear. Sometimes he talks about the one and the henads as in an exactly parallel fashion to intellect and intellect, soul and souls, right? So there's the unparticipated principle, like the form, and then there are the many participated instances, right? The things that belong to something and give it that property. So there's beauty itself, and there's the beauty of souls, the beauty of bodies, the beauty of this body, the beauty of that soul. So sometimes he talks about the one of the henads that way. There's the one itself, then there's the divine order of being, the divine order of life, and so on. So analogous to a form and its instances. Other times, however, he talks about these gods, these henads, as if each of them is primary. Each of them, they are dependent on nothing. And then it sounds like each of them is somehow the one. You have both, there are people who run with both things. There are people who, so like Van Riel, and this is, I guess, the older interpretation, Dodds also have seen the henads as somehow dependent on the one, and they see the one as hypostatized as a first principle. Then there's people like Edward Butler, Radek Schlupp, who then see that each of the gods itself is absolute. Their relationship to the one, they throw up their hands. Edward Butler will go so far as to say that the one is nothing but the gods, right? And they have textual support as well, and it's really hard to see how to cash them out. But yeah, so are they another level? You can talk that way, but they certainly don't work like the other levels, right? So that's what there is to say. No, there's much more, but for an initial answer. Yeah. Oh, and pronoia. So pronoia will belong to these henads, right? And
as a henad, or
yeah, qua henads. Yeah, exactly. Qua, because each, as the one's identical with the good, each henad is itself a goodness, and as a goodness, it bestows value on other things. It makes other things good, and that is the primary providence. That is the truth.
oh.
Yeah. And that's, yeah, that's how, in some sense, you're right.
So probably the first providence is an ordering among henads, or no?
Oh, no, why? Oh, if there's a prior ordering, no, this is the ordering of the henads is entirely vicarious for Proclus. So each of them is absolute, so there's no real order amongst them. Butler has introduced this term of polycentric multiplicity. So each of them is the center of the whole multiplicity. That's a way of thinking about them without having to order them. But Proclus talks about this in the Elements, that order of henads, to say that one henad is prior to another, is vicarious on the beings that they cause. And so it's actually the beings organized hierarchically, and because of that, we talk about henads. So when we say that Dionysus is son of Zeus, for instance, that's because Dionysus is the god of this world, as when we say the world is a god, right, in the Timaeus, but whereas Zeus is the demiurge. Now, what does this mean? So Zeus, qua demiurge, is cause of the world, right? Because the demiurge is a nous, and it's cause for the eternal structures of the world. So there's a causal relationship between the demiurge and the world, and because of that, then we say that Dionysus is son of Zeus. But between Dionysus taken as a henad, as a simple unity, and Zeus taken as a simple unity, there's no relation between them, right?
There's equality and diversity.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so Proclus will even use different terms for that. So he'll use sameness and difference when talking about this amongst the forms, but when he talks about it amongst the henads, he says that each god has its own idiotes, peculiarity, hallmark, right, and that they're united not by same as by but by henosis, right? Somehow they're all one and unified, but he doesn't really give a way of cashing this out. Butler's notion of polycentric multiplicity is one way, but again, we have to go beyond the text to understand it. Yeah. And Providence is there, yeah, with them.
So we've got maybe another 10 minutes to
okay.
finish off. And
Sure, yeah. Oh, so that's great. I thought we had right.
and then we'll have a drinks reception.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So then why did I get to say something precisely about past, present, and future?
Yeah,
Another
please.
grounded. So what I've done here in this last part 3, I've given you 2 additional texts, which are the Greek of one text and then English and Greek of a part from the commentary on the Timaeus. I couldn't give you the English here for the Parmenides because it's in the part you found out. And I read a bit of it before. So what I want to do is now summarize. I won't read these, but rather I will. Let's just jump straight to this table that you have at the back. So it should be right. And here I've separated what Proclus has to say about, or separate and organize what he has to say about past and the power of closure, present the power of connection, and future the power of disclosure in different contexts. And so closure here is the power of closures is dynamis, connection is synectike, and disclosure is right, just so you have the things. So it seems so that there's this one power that gives, so let me just focus first of all on the present, right, just to give that as an example of what kind of grounding we have. Right, so he says that that time has a power which is such as to connect and sustain all beings. This is also their connection to their being, that gives closure to the beings of things. It sustains them as they come to be according to their appropriate series of stages of change. He says this is connected to the is, the present, and that it connects the past and the future of what is present. So I take this to be the idea. So Proclus has this notion, right? So time is this separate intellect that what it has is the content of this intellect is the development of the world, right? Of the great year, right? And at each moment, like the king general in the De Mundo, it says now this has to happen, now that has to happen. And how does this give? And now this gives connection to the world in the sense that at each moment of time, only one phase of the world is there. However, we can say that the world is present because there is this one plan, this one blueprint connecting all the different stages, right? And so in that way, this power of connection constitutes the present. Right? And I would say then similar things about past and future. So he connects past the power of closure or perfect making. Now, again, if you have a plan for how something develops, and Proclus thinks not only the whole world is a plan, but that each individual being also has it. Even artifacts have plans, even though they don't grow, they have, unfortunately, expiration dates. And and also prophecy is romantic as part of his argument, you know. So you can tell you that things will go away at some point, and so that shows that there's some kind of order, some kind of number they're following, and so that will tell you the beginning, middle, and end of that thing. So that means that each thing has an end, prescribed end, And even if it doesn't fulfill its end, right, animals that die before they reach maturity, still the fact that they have that number establishes that they're finite things, and that they can, and at some point they will be passed, right? And so in this way, this power of giving closure, of giving perfection, is constitutive of the things being passed. And similarly, because now the measures of each thing exist and the measure of the whole world exists, even though the future states have not yet come to pass, they're already revealed. And in that sense, they constitute the future. So it seems that in this way, you have this power of disclosure, right? And that constitutes the future. And so I think, so in that sense, these three features of closure, connection, disclosure, ground past, present, and future for Proclus. How to then connect this to the talk about the two kinds of pronoia and nous? It would seem then that that closure or perfection is a good, and that the angeloi, the messengers, are then noes that know all of being according to this good, according to this good of closure. Right? And then the daimonis again with connection, and the heroes with revelation, right, or disclosure. And so that would be the, and then so they grasp the measures of each thing, the forms of each thing, according to this particular aspect, and thereby they help distinguish time into past, present, and future. All right, it's still there's still many gaps to fill, but that's basically the idea.
Since we're coming to a point where we ought to draw things to a
Close.
I wonder if you could summarize what you think Proclus's distinctive contribution on the question of time is in relation to well, what is his, I mean,
right, okay. I can do that. It's connected with this. So as I was just saying, what's central to his notion of time is this idea that everything has its lifespan, so to speak. And so what his starting point is this idea that there are propitious moments and not propitious moments. He really takes this phenomenon of the kairos, so the opportune moment, when different natural cycles so intersect that it's the appropriate moment for something to happen. That's the basis of his thinking for time. And so that's not a psychological route like Augustine or Plotinus. It's also not the route that you find in Aristotle, who he tries to think of time as a measure and what it's measuring, and also not in Plato, at least the first view, with the basis this Urbild, Abbild, this image, paradigm image. It's really this, he takes the kairos as a starting point, and that's really unique for a philosophy of time, but of course it's not unique for understanding time in general, right? If you look at Michel Eliad's Time and Cosmos, will give you tons of examples of different religious views according to this idea of different moments of time being privileged, and this idea of kairos is really central to different cultures' understanding of time. But Proclus is really relatively unique as a philosopher that was trying to really work this out. Right.
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. Just to conclude, I should say that it's particularly appropriate to the Beierwaltes seminar to be discussing Proclus, since Werner Beierwaltes wrote his Habilitation on Proclus, and Proclus is one of his major early works, and so for this reason and for other reasons, we're very grateful to Antonio Vargas for giving us such a rich and stimulating lecture on Proclus on time. So thank you very much. Now we have some to as it were, inaugurate the